Why don't I start all the way on the end? Many of you know them, but Ronnie Chan is chairman of Hang Lung Group, co-founder of the Morningside Group, and as far as we're concerned, not only the co-chair of the Asia Society and the chairman of the board of our Hong Kong Center, but really one of the great champions of the institution, and has been so for a long time. And he'll say he's not an expert, but he's an expert on pretty much every subject that's up there. Mitch Julis, to my right, is co-chair and founder of Canyon Partners, a global asset management firm. Mitch is a relatively new and great addition to our global board, and a generous, I should add, founding supporter and funding supporter of our new Asia Society Policy Institute. Mitch has also done some homework which was not assigned for this event, so there'll be a separate little PowerPoint that he'll take us through, and I've had a look, and it's not only informative, but it's entertaining. And lastly, Hamid Biglari, who has been deeply involved since my arrival at Asia Society and before in the conceptual planning and thinking of the Asia Society Policy Institute. And this, I'm sounding like a broken record, but another person who I was just saying to my colleague Bruce Pickering is a guy you'd want on a panel about just about anything Asia-related, so we're delighted you're all here. So to jump right into these propositions on the board, the U.S. and Iran, for all the negativity we've heard, despite the domestic opposition in both countries, there will be a comprehensive deal on the nuclear front. Probably a minority view, we'll dive into that. China and Japan, no more dangerous flashpoint in Asia right now than those islands in Northeast Asia. That may be a less controversial proposition, but we have had across the Asia Society Network, that quote was actually taken from a program we did about 10 days ago, a program that I should say left those of us in the audience feeling a lot more nervous, I think, when we left than when we walked in. To India, Narendra Modi's victory, if it does come to pass, and as you may know, he and the BJP party looking like frontrunners at the moment, will spark a sea change. Finally, a more business-friendly and effective government will be in place. And then the last 2 points are on global investment and economic growth. China, that 7 to 8% growth is not only not sustainable, but nor is China's ability to manage the political consequences of a downturn. And lastly, emerging markets. I should add, Hamid ran emerging markets for Citi for many years. The era of double-digit economic growth in Asia's emerging markets is over. Now, so just to go right to the first proposition, and we won't spend too much time on each, again, to leave some time for questions and further discussion. I'm going to pick on Hamid, not only because he's Iranian-American, but has deep expertise in this. Do you think that's a overly optimistic assessment? This issue has kind of drifted away from the headlines given everything that's going on in Crimea and other fronts. Maybe that's a good thing. What do you think?
Well, it's a complicated proposition. So the way I would approach it is to ask, as you do in any negotiation, what would be considered a win for the P5+1, and what would be a win from the Iranian government's point of view. A win for the P5+1 would have 3 elements. The first one would be that there would be verifiable limits and caps to Iran's nuclear capability. The second would be that there would be an increase in the ability to detect and credibly respond in the event of a breakout nuclear capability. And the third would be to decrease Iran's incentive to develop a nuclear weapon. From Rouhani's side, there would also be 3 dimensions to a win. The first one would be to protect Iran's right, as they would define it, under the NPT to have peaceful nuclear capability, and in their definition, that does include uranium enrichment. The second would be to preserve as much as possible Iran's current nuclear capability, both research and development and enrichment. And the third would be to remove the sanctions, economic sanctions against Iran. If you look at those 2 dimensions, as anyone experienced in negotiation would say, that there is the possibility for overlap between them. So left to their own devices, I think the negotiating teams would get to an agreement.
But they're not left to their own devices, are they?
That's the issue. So I think that as soon as the elements of a deal like that are announced, the elements on both sides would call the deal a bad deal. I think that Netanyahu would be at the front of the segment on the West side that would call it a bad deal because the West gave too much leeway to Iran. And I think the hardliners in Iran would criticize the Rouhani government for accepting too much reduction in coming up with an agreement. And so I am pessimistic that there will be a deal in the time frame that people are discussing, which is in the next 6 or so months. I expect that because of the different elements, finding that common ground would take longer than many people think. And my fear is that expectations have been built up to a great extent for a quick agreement. These are complicated issues to square off. And my worry is that the Rouhani government's ability to move forward would be dramatically handicapped by those within Iran who don't want to see a deal. And so I think that's the challenge.
So, and this question for Mitch or Ronnie, any of you who want to jump in, if there isn't a deal, I mean, I think it's interesting the point you make about expectations. The expectations at the moment, it seems to be kind of the front burner questions that was so hot not that long ago in terms of global trouble spots. I don't know whether people or investors, the public generally, have kind of taken this off, front burner worry concern. I mean, no deal obviously could put us right back in all these horrible discussions about war footing and all the rest. Is this something, Mitch, do you think has kind of, has the tension from the marketplace or in any other way diffused at all, or?
Well, there's the expression, where you stand depends on where you sit, right? And I have a son who's studying at a yeshiva in Israel for the year before he goes to college, and he also is working for Dory Gold's think tank in Jerusalem. And Iran hardly comes up. So he's at the epicenter of concern.
Hardly comes up.
Hardly comes up. Now, and you notice that Netanyahu really didn't bring up the issue of the sanctions bill when he addressed AIPAC on Monday. So I think I think that from Israel's standpoint, which would, as you said, led by Netanyahu, would be part of the Western opposition to any deal if a deal was constructed. From Israel's standpoint, they're trying to lay low. They're working behind the scenes. If you look at AIPAC's stance on this issue, they bowed to the Obama administration's pressure to not ask for a vote in the Senate, and because essentially the way it was framed by the Obama administration is that those who opposed this peace effort were leading the United States to war. Right. And that's a very highly loaded thing, and when you have a particular ethnic or religious group that's associated with the notion that we're leading the United States to war, even a powerful organization like AIPAC will step back.
Just so everybody folks know, American-Israeli Public Affairs Committee, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think it's receded, even in the hot spot.
Well, I mean, what you say about your son is fascinating. I thought you were going to say something different, but where you stand is where you sit, and he's sitting there, and it's not coming up. That's interesting. So,
I mean, it would imply that it would be a big deal, but it isn't.
So let's go from one hot spot that may be simmering a little to one that's maybe going in the other direction. In addition to the statement up here about no more dangerous flashpoint, we have heard, it came up a lot at Davos, Josette Sheeran, our president, references at our dinner here last night, even more frightening comparisons that refer to China and Japan to Asia in 2014 starting to resemble in strange ways Europe in 1914. And that's obviously frightening for a whole host of reasons, but this is the crisis that I think gives rise to that kind of discussion. Ronnie, do you, from your vantage point, want to Do you think that's overstated? Do you think, are we worrying enough or not enough?
Number two, right?
China. Yeah.
Okay. About 6 or 8 months ago, I gave a talk in Kyoto, of all places in Japan, about this topic. So I'm really a gutsy guy, and then I gave another talk in Mumbai. Not exactly friendly to the Chinese on the same topic. And 6, 8 months ago, I was a little bit more sanguine about it. And the reason is this. The reason is because China is extraordinarily rational about it, although what you have to worry is not the government, it is the people. Mm-hmm. Japan, as Zhu Rongji said to me one time, he said there's no China-Japan relations. There's only a China-US relations. Now, it has been so until recently. If you assume that former Premier Zhu Rongji's statement is still correct, then there's less to be worried about, because basically the United States doesn't want a war with China. However, why am I a little bit less sanguine today? Because I think Japan's position is now must be really worrying Washington, D.C. That is, will Japan still listen to the United States in some of the things? And that, has Japan grown out of the protective shield of the United States, so to speak? And Abe certainly have been taking actions that indicates that maybe the United States can no longer hold on to Japan. If so, then I think it's a very worrisome situation. Now, 10 years ago, I have advocated, I said, why should Japan not be a normal nation having its own military and this and that? Why not? How long do you have to wait after the Second World War? So far, it has been a very peaceful nation. The only thing is this, and there's only one caveat in my mind that Japan has to deal with before it can become a regular nation in the sense that you have your own defense force and this and that. And that is, you have to admit, you have to deal with history. Mm-hmm. I just know of no other country in the world where en masse, wholesale denial of history. My wife grew up in Japan. Her Japanese is better than her Chinese. And in Japan, young people have no idea what happened 60, 70 years ago. And that's really, at the end of the day, the most worrisome thing. But take it into a higher level, and this is my last statement, and that is, this is not the few islands, it's not that. Right. It is really the future of China and the future of Japan. People ask the question in this country, what is the future of China? Which to me, I think I know the answer in general direction, no sense. Because if you were to draw lessons from history of 2,500 years of China, I think it's not that difficult to argue where China is going in the next 25 years, because there's 2,500 years behind it in the same direction. The question, rather, that need to be asked, as far as I'm concerned, is, what is the future of Japan? That's a question that nobody asks. But I think that is a question that must be asked. So Japan is just not comfortable having the rise of China, but it's inevitable. So the world has to get used to it. But I think the most dangerous, still I believe that the critical player in this whole thing is the United States of America. And sorry, one last thing.
That's okay.
Recently, I heard a statement made by, I think it was John Kerry, that really worries me. Or maybe it was Obama. He says, Japan is an ally. Now, what does that statement mean? That statement means China is not an ally. And if that is the case, you right away you take sides. And as I tell my Japanese friend, if the United States were to take sides with China, Japan will go crazy. Vice versa. If the United States were to take sides with Japan, China won't go crazy, but it will be very upset.
He's referring to the treaty obligation, right?
And so forth. Right. And so this ally thing really reminds me of what Josette has been asking the question, that is 1914 versus 2014. What happened in 1914? It's the different alignment of allies that really caused the trouble. And if today, when there's no clear war, and if the world begin to talk about allies, that's a very dangerous thing. Because when you talk about allies, you're automatically saying that the ones that I don't mention are not my allies. You right away draw a line on the sand, and you have two camps. And that, to me, is really a dangerous thing. I think the United States, the best posture is still the one that 10 years ago they advocate, that is strategic ambiguity. We're the big brother in this whole game, like it or not, that's true. And the Chinese will be the first to recognize. So as the United States, don't take sides. Just like you have two sons, if you take sides all the time, you have a problem with the other son. Not that Japan and China are sons, but you know what I mean. So I think the United States should just don't take sides and let it be. And I think that the world will be a much better place, and that part of the world will be a much better place.
Okay, you've put a lot on the table. I do think we should probably, and we can come back to all of these at the end. We'll go to item 3, but I do want to, just because you've said so much about the 1914 comparison. This was from The Economist the other day. The most troubling similarity between 1914 and today is complacency. Business people too busy making money to notice the serpents flickering at the bottom of their trading screens, politicians playing with nationalism just as they did 100 years ago. So now you can be as depressed as we were at the end of our program a couple of weeks ago at the Asia Society. So just to go to India now, where if you listen to a lot of people who have appeared on our stages, but particularly the business community in India and those who watch the business climate there, this idea that not only that Mr. Modi and his party are headed for a big victory, but that for the first time in a long time and maybe ever, we will be facing a truly business-friendly and more effective government in place. Hamid, I'll put you on the spot to start that one. Do you have thoughts?
So what I would say, Tom, is that India is a bit of a contradiction in terms, in the sense that it has a bureaucracy that befits a large, well-developed economy, and a democracy that befits a early stage country. And the tension between those two always results in things taking longer to resolve than they need to. They're always 10 years behind where they need to be, and the horizon keeps receding. If you compare where Iran is, where India is relative to China, for example, India should have been much further ahead had some of these issues not been there. The second observation I would make about India is that the central government is relatively weak in terms of making decisions about the country, whereas the states are extremely powerful in terms of making decisions about the states themselves. The fear that I have about Modi and people's expectations of Modi and change in India is that Modi has been extremely effective in terms of getting the state of Gujarat to be as successful as it has been, because as a chief of a state, he has enormous influence. He will have nowhere near that influence if he takes on the leadership of the entire country. And his ability to make change happen is going to be much more constrained than people believe. And that may be a reason why someone who is very successful on one stage may not be as successful in the other stage. But I think he's a very interesting personality.
Mitch, Ronnie, either one of you want to jump in? Ronnie, I know you travel to India a lot. Mitch?
Well, I just have a couple of observations, really not being an expert at all on this area, that speak to the notions of what I'll be presenting in a broader sense. But India is one of those countries where it's limited by its balance sheet, in a sense. I'll be talking about balance sheets, but it doesn't have a reserve currency. It has, which is a very strong strategic weapon. But what it does have, it has a large population, a growing population. And as you pointed out, though, the government really doesn't match the needs of the people and really harness those people in the best way with structural reform. So the resources, the left side of the balance sheet, have to be harnessed in a much more managed way, which from a political policy standpoint means effective structural reform. Now the question is Modi the kind of candidate to deliver that on a national basis? And that's an open question, right? Whether the desire is there, number one, and the instrumentality of government is going to be effective in doing so. And the thing about India is always surprised and always disappointed in many respects.
But I guess with Mr. Modi himself, are people overstating, I understand what you're saying about the ability to govern a state versus governing such an unwieldy country, but he does come from a background that is unusual and maybe close to unprecedented in terms of coming to the prime ministership. And does that count for anything? I mean, I guess I'm asking, or getting back to that statement, should we be bullish on India if he wins?
I'll give you a bull case.
What case?
A bullish case for Modi, and that is a general observation about the emerging markets as opposed to India in particular. The nature of emerging market countries is because of the absence of deep institutional foundations. The personality of a strong leader is make or break in terms of the future of that country. China would be nowhere where it is today without a Deng Xiaoping being its leader. Singapore would be nowhere where it is today without Lee Kuan Yew. Brazil would be a stagflationary country if it wasn't for Cardoso. And Turkey wouldn't have had the incredible progress if it hadn't been for Erdogan. So the personality of a great leader can transform a country. Modi has very interesting characteristics to be that kind of a leader, but the nature of such leadership is that it tends to be more authoritarian in order to push things through a system that is not designed to move very fast. And that is the real enigma about what Modi can do.
You know, I was in India 2 weeks ago, and I'll be back in India 2 weeks later. And it's truly amazing how, not many months ago, all my friends in the business world want to see Modi win, but nobody thinks he will win. And then 2 local elections happened, and bingo, he's now in. Personally speaking, I really like to see Modi in for one reason. I really want to see if India can take off economically. And if anyone has a chance to do it, Modi has a chance. That's it. There's a couple of things that worries me. Number one, whenever you take an extreme position in India, you take your own life in your own hands. Your life in your own hands. It's, there's a lot of things happen there that are pretty scary. Number two, the social policy of this gentleman, his history worries many people. And then I suppose it depends on whether the guy wins big or not. And if he wins big, hopefully he will build enough momentum to get some of the fundamental things through in the first period of his administration. If not, I fear that the systemic lethargy will set in, and then he will be stuck like everybody else. One last phenomenon that I think is very we should watch, at least with the corner of our eyes, is the common man party, and that is, people are just sick and tired of the corruption and so forth, and so there's a lot of things boiling with smaller parties. By the way, a very similar situation is happening in Italy. In Italy, you also have a party like that. I forgot the name of it, but basically against political leaders' corruption. In India, you have something boiling right there. But it's easy to be opposed to something, such as corruption, but it is difficult to say, okay, how do you do it? And these are issues that just are totally unresolved. And if Modi were to win, corruption is not going to get any better, although he will institute things, policies, pro-business policies. So while you're being pro-business, the economy may pick up, but what happened to the corruption? And hence the man on the streets' desire for change in the social side of things rather than just the business side. Those people, the majority of them, care for their social issues rather than business issue. Only the business leaders care for it, and that's always a small part.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to the fourth item, China's growth, which really has a couple of parts to it. And the first, why don't we just do in one-line form? I'll put you completely on the spot. The proposition here is the growth rate of 7 to 8% and beyond is unsustainable at the moment. So why don't we just say, okay, shall we say next 3 years, give me an average growth rate for the Chinese economy. I know you have opinions. One word, one number.
One number for the next 3 years. It's a question of whether
you can't do it in 1 minute.
No, it's a question of whether what number what is credible. But my guess would be 5 to 6%.
Mitch?
7.
I think one sentence. In the next 2-3 years, maybe 6, 7. But in the long run, I think 7, 8 is very doable, say for the thereafter for the next 10 years.
Okay, so maybe that obviates the need to go to the second part of this because, unless maybe I'll just ask Hamid, if the low end, if this proposition is right, and our panel of experts don't, I think, really think it is, but if there were to be a significant downturn or just a drop of some kind, politically, how able do you think the Chinese government is going to be in terms of, with all the sea of issues it has with this giant reform agenda, to deal with a drop in the rate and a downturn in the economy?
Let me say that the reason I'm slightly less sanguine than my partners on the stage is that I think that periods of rapid credit growth generally don't end well. If you look at what's happened in China, too much credit has been chasing after investments that don't generate sufficient cash flow. The rate of credit to GDP has gone from 130% to 190% in the period of 4 years. That is faster than the rate of credit growth in the United States pre the financial crisis that we experienced. So I think that this is a very serious challenge. And number one. Number two, I think that it is unrealistic to expect that countries continue to have that pace of growth as they evolve from one stage of their growth to another stage of their growth, just as you don't expect children to continue to increase their height when they grow from being children to being teenagers to being adults. So I think it's only natural that it will slow down. Whether or not, I think that the Chinese government has broadened over the last 20 years as I've interacted with them. They are far more sophisticated than perhaps a lot of people give them credit for. I think they understand all of these issues, but China is a complex and powerful set of provinces, and bringing all of those issues under control would challenge anyone. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I think that...
No, that's... And I'm just wondering, given our time constraints, first of all, Hamid has tiptoed into question 5, or proposition 5, about emerging markets and the era of double-digit growth, I guess with these, take your metaphor, these young children who have stopped growing. And I think, am I right, Mitch, that your presentation, I just want to make sure we leave a little bit of time for that and a little time for questions, or maybe a lot of time for questions. So maybe, do you want to...
Yeah, let me just, I think it's a good time to just provide a little bit of an additional context for the discussion about these specific areas, because they're, in many ways they're very much linked.
And I'll try not to hit the gong too soon, but as quickly as you can.
Yeah. And but essentially, let's see. Is it up there? No.
Hazel, a little help, or Thomas?
I don't think I shut it off. Okay, I'm back.
Okay, I told you it was entertaining.
Okay, here we go. So what I'm trying to, the issue on China as regards this presentation is whether in the long run the 7% is or plus percent is sustainable, that kind of growth. In the short run, I think they have the levers to do it, as I'll show you in this presentation. The question is, if you go out 3 years and they're still generating 7+%, do they hit a wall because something builds in the system that causes it to reach a tipping point? So what's behind a lot of these issues is the balance sheets that are being wielded by these big governments, whether you're talking about the United States, Japan, China, or the EU. And this is part of the thing we're seeing with Russia, which is the hard power where they send in troops versus the soft power where their stock market goes down big time because their ruble declines versus the dollar. So anyway, a little disclaimer, I have to because I manage money. This little, so look, we're making all these great predictions, but the world's complex. And unless you recognize that the world's complex, you're going to get blindsided. So that's what this cartoon is about. Now, there's a simple way of understanding the complexity of the world and these very complex questions and predictions we're being asked to make. So, like human beings tend to look at things unidirectionally. So if you have a problem, you push the problem away, right? But what is the problem is sort of like the old Talmudic expression, man plans and God laughs. You don't see the big picture, and as a consequence, this is what goes on, right? You get hit. So, in other words, in a complex world, you have feedback, you have time delays, you have nonlinearity, like when water turns to ice. There's a tipping point. You know, Malcolm Gladwell talks about it. Anyway, how does this show up in the financial market, and what does it mean geopolitically? I'm just going to run through these slides. The easiest way that you see policy being made today, which is the soft power, but hugely impactful. So, you know, yes, when somebody says, I'm your ally, that has all the connotations of hard power. But when they have their central banks starting to really muscle up and affecting currencies, that's more diplomatic, but not less impactful. So let's look at what's happened to the U.S. dollar versus the euro. Here, you got that. And you see that, you know, during the time of the crisis, it declined. Now it's been pretty strong. You have the next one is the RMB. So, you know, what was interesting was that there's been an appreciation of the RMB, and now, the appreciation of the RMB, and now it's starting to weaken again. Now, why is it weakening? Well, look at what's Japan doing? They're weakening their currency, right? It's been strong. So you got these two big balance sheets. Look at, Japan, China up against each other, like tectonic plates. They're both trying to weaken their currencies. Why? Because they're exporting their internal issues. Now, the sustainability of China at 7%, they got all these different levers, right? So one of the levers is to start weakening their currency again and take the political flack from the United States of saying, hey, your currency is just being weakened so you can have more exports. But the Chinese will say, well, you want Japan to do it, why can't we do it, right? So now you got these two balance sheets bumping up against each other. Now look at when I talk about balance sheets and currency implications, look at the Federal Reserve. We went from $750 billion to over $4 trillion. That's a lot of CUSIPs, as Hal would understand it. A lot of CUSIPs being bought there. 16 trillion of CUSIPs. Look at the European Central Bank. They expanded big time, and now they're draining liquidity from the system, which is very troubling because people fear that you're going to get into a deflation trap again with all the debt that's being built up. Look at the Bank of Japan. That muscular exercise under Abe of its balance sheet. So I'm almost finished. Joseph Nye, you guys know about him, soft power. A lot of soft power is being wielded through these central bank and sovereign balance sheets. And you can't understand geopolitical events unless you take that into consideration. So look at that. We have a case study, as I said at the beginning of this. Ukraine. The oligarchs, Putin, he can send in all the troops he wants, but if his stock market declines 10% and the ruble depreciates, he's going to start thinking hard about whether or not he's going to upset his sort of like gangster-like fiefdom there, because the oligarchs are going to complain. They're going to tell him, hey, we want to get our money out of Russia, we want to have freedom, and you're screwing it up for us just because you think you want to resurrect the Russian Empire. So these constraints show up in geopolitical decisions. And the last thing I wanted to say is, arguably, we always talk about clash of civilizations driving political events, But, you know, you got to know accounting in today's world. And unless you see how these big balance sheets are being thrust against each other, you're not going to be able to answer these questions fully. And so now the last thing is to say, okay, which is the best example of small balance sheets, no reserve currencies that have benefited from this, you know, this cheap monetary policy, this insurance policy that has been issued by all the central banks in the post-Lehman world? Who have benefited the most? The emerging markets. And now, why do you see them going through trials and tribulations? Because to the extent that an emerging market country has a current account deficit that has been financed by cheap debt, which has a question of being refinanced in today's world, things are going to start to get a little bit antsy. And there's a paper by Hyun Shin, Princeton, who's going to BIS, who's going to be the chief research person, which speaks to this shock point in the corporate debt of the emerging market countries, because as the central banks drain liquidity from the system, whether it's tapering in the United States or Draghi trying to build back his reserves to do something later on with the blessing of the Bundesbank and Merkel, because he's, as you saw, the ECB balance sheet has declined from its peak. All that reverberates, particularly in the emerging markets. Anyway, that's it.
I told you he did his homework. That was great, Mitch. Thank you. So let's, if any of you have questions, we'd love to take those. Just to recap, I think if I have this right, there may be a deal between the U.S. and Iran, not so soon, and the temperature is at least being lowered in the, as we wait. Temperature rising on China and Japan, right? And hopefully won't rise too much more. Modi's win would make a big difference, but maybe expectations are a little high. China may take some short-term hits, but this panel at least thinks they may be okay, maybe you notwithstanding in the long term. And I guess the jury's out, or a little bit antsy, Mitch says, on the emerging markets front. But anything you'd like to ask, as I think you can tell, our powerhouse roundtable here can take on these issues and more. And Hal has a question here in the middle.
Mine is not really a question, but looking at India. The most important thing in understanding India is to understand that the poor vote. And the poor vote, and they have a significant interest in the way the country's economy is shaped, the way the country's law system is shaped, and this has been going on ever since they've gotten their independence. India is a dysfunctional democracy. It's law, we talk about its country being a country of law and order, but the legal system is broken down. Everything takes forever to get done. I had a friend who had a joint venture in Bengal, small joint venture. Within a year, he tried to dissolve that joint venture. 8 years later, he still had the joint venture because Bengal was for so long a period of time, up until recently, run by the Communist Party. India, on a state level, is a socialist country. And when you get in the big cities, the land is controlled. It's controlled by the city legislators. They bring in thousands and thousands of people to continue the shanties that are built in the major cities of India in order for them to vote and stay in place. So when you talk about a guy like Morty, he says what the Western capitalists and the entrepreneurs and the private equity people want to hear. He talks the talk and he walks the walk of a capitalist. But that doesn't necessarily work in a country like India over a period of time. It'll work for a short period of time. He'll get the headlines. He'll make some differences. But if you talk about India today, they're still splitting up their states because there's such significant interest. On an ethnic and on a linguistic basis, India is a problem that isn't solved by one man in here. There's been a continuing shift. There are great disparities between the Hindu and the Muslim population, the reactionary Hindu population and the liberal population. So when you talk about Morty making a difference, it'll be in the headlines. But the problem with India is so fundamental to that country that it's difficult, unless you understand where it starts from. It's easy to make a distinction from up here it doesn't translate to down here.
Thank you, Hal. I think actually to that point and to Hamid's, I mean, the argument's been made that a country like the United States ought to really start opening consulates and having relations with the state governors in that country as much or even more so than with the central government. Any other questions? Yeah, Steve?
Hi, Steve Chung here. I want to pick up on the point that Ronnie had made about China and Japan. I had a chance to be a lecturer 5 years ago in China, at the China Foreign Affairs University, which sort of grooms future generations of Chinese diplomats. I was surprised these were, 17, 18-year-old kids, and up until then, as a Korean American, I thought no one sort of hated the Japanese more than the Koreans until I got to China, and I was really surprised by that. What worried me was, aside from the rhetoric and all of that, that some of these sort of animosities that don't really surface sometimes run really deep in the societies, and especially to the younger generation, that shocked me. And it's a brewing thing that's sort of cloaked in the issues of history and, war reparations and apologies. But I don't see how this gets resolved, and maybe I'm too young to sort of know how this plays out. But aside from doing nothing, which I think is maybe not an option for the United States, what can the United States be doing to facilitate a constructive framework for conversations like this without taking sides? And how does this end up in a positive way for the rest of the world?
Ronnie, you want to try that one? Well, is there a Nobel Peace Prize here somewhere?
Not me. First of all, I think that China as a government should, I think it's able to control the people's sentiments. And that's one good thing about having a more authoritarian government. Not that overall it's a good idea. I think Japan, the issue is really Japan, whether Japan is willing to play ball with the United States. As long as that is the case, it's okay. If not, then it's always the danger of the shot. One shot can change the world, like the First World War, and so we have to be careful about it. But overall, I'm still betting that it will be okay. And after all, last night we heard from Ambassador Crocker, and I told him afterwards. I said, before the East Asia anything blows up, your part of the world may give all of us trouble first. In which case, that which happens in the East Asia is not going to be, doesn't matter.
Yeah, I mean, just a different part of that to your question is, and this has come up a lot in the panels and discussions we've had, is just the management of potential miscalculations. That seems, for obvious reasons, to be the big worry. I don't know, I'm not privy to what kind of back-channel discussions are underway. Certainly that's an area where the U.S. could play a role. I think we have a question there and then here. Yes, sir.
Rhonda Pino. We're going to be talking about health and innovation in the next session, but I was curious about your economic perspective on the changing demographics in Asia, where in 1955, the average life expectancy in China was 42, and today it's 74. And after the age of 60, there's a doubling of these major, very costly diseases every 5 years. So culminating in about 1 in 2 risks for Alzheimer's, cancer by age 80, 85. So when you look at the changing demographics and not just the burden of managing the health care and the expectations of that population is now that they should receive health care. And you also look at the fact that a lot of the individuals with the one-child policy and so on, not having sufficient individuals that are actually working to support those that are going to need to have their health care maintained. How do you see that playing out economically over the decades ahead? I think the comments about there being a certain growth rate in the foreseeable future, I think makes a lot of sense to all of us. But as you look out 2030, there's about a 50% increase in the incidence of these diseases in those countries. So how do you think that's going to play out economically? Will it be a drag? Will it be helpful? Will it fuel new industries? What do you think decades ahead?
Thank you. That, by the way, is Dr. Ron DePino from MD Anderson, who will be up here as a panelist in a moment on the healthcare innovation. Do you want to take that, Mitch?
Yeah, I think that many countries are going to be facing these demographic headwinds. That is aging populations. The United States is better positioned than Europe and perhaps China, given the one-child policy and what's going on in the next 20 years. They're going to try to reverse that to the extent they can. India obviously benefits from, did I say headwinds? I meant tailwinds. Yeah, headwinds. And India has some tailwinds because their population is growing. Now the question is, can they handle that growth within their society? The issue of health is a huge one because diseases of affluence add significantly to the costs of a society. And if you look at the way China is constructed, the unifying element about the way they use their balance sheet, so to speak, is repression. They repress the return on investment, which they're trying to ease up on. So therefore, if you put money into a savings account, you earn very little. They're trying to allow you to diversify your investment choices within China. They were allowing their currency, as I showed you in those slides, to appreciate versus the dollar. Now they're, again, making it depreciate as a safety valve, and that means that the internal consumer has less buying power, so that's another form of repression. It's designed to stimulate exports and keep reserves up so the central government has the liquidity to do what it needs to do to patch up the growth model's infirmity, which is overlending to continue growth and to plug holes in the system. So this repression particularly shows up in the lack of a social safety net. So people have to save, they can't spend, and they know that they have to provide for their own health needs. And if they're eating foods that come from McDonald's or Kentucky Fried Chicken or other things that weren't available to them, they're going to have to not only provide for their parents as they get older, and then they're going to have to provide for themselves. So this deadweight cost shows up currently in the fact that the consumer doesn't spend enough. You don't have enough consumer-led growth. Of the 7% growth in China, half of it is due to investment. The issue on the investment is, are they over-investing to spur that growth, and is it being misallocated? You could argue that if they were willing to allow more delegation of power and more consumer choice, they would have more of a social safety net, and that would free up the ability of the consumer to spend more. And in addition, if there was better provision of medical services as part of that safety net, perhaps they'd make wiser choices that would offset some of these headwinds.
Okay, we have time, I think, just for one question right here we've promised, and a quick answer, and then I think we better wrap. Yeah.
I have a question that I think overlays a number of the points that you had up on the screen. But first, just a comment back to your statement of where you said depends on where you stand. I had to go to Japan during Chinese New Year for negotiation in Osaka and Tokyo. And while it was easy to get a flight, it was almost impossible to get a hotel room. I ended up staying quite a ways out of Tokyo. But Tokyo, Osaka, Kyoto, Hokkaido, Mount Fuji, as my Japanese friends said, if they didn't know better and woke up one day and looked out, they would have thought they'd been invaded by China. It was one of the places of choice for the Chinese New Year holiday. So again, I'm not quite sure it's as bad with people to people as we sometimes think. The question I had, though, has to do with the U.S. pivot to Asia, which some people have described more as a quick head turn. And just the impact of that, is it going to be a positive, negative? Does it create more issues than it addresses? Just like to hear the panel's comments.
It's a big question. Who wants it?
I'll take a quick stab at it, and that is that I thought it was a naive statement when it was made, because it suggested a more muscular view of Asia than I think was really intended, and a shift away from Middle East. The problems of the Middle East are resolved, was implicit in the statement, or are going to be resolved. We're going to shift, which exacerbated some of the issues that existed in that part of the world, including Ukraine and elsewhere. So it was a poorly thought through statement to begin with. Having said that, it's inevitable that it has raised tensions or concerns within China about the intent behind that statement as it relates to the Philippines, as it relates to Japan, as it relates to Korea, which I thought was unnecessary. And I think there's the fact that it has become more of a head turn has been an understanding that there needs to be a de-escalation from that kind of approach in terms of getting the right balance done with the Chinese.
Okay, allow me to mop up on a couple of the questions. First of all, Mitch, I think the question is really not, is China going to be more consumption-led versus in the past investment-led? Rather, the question is, why do they do it the other way, the old way? And if you understand that, then you understand that China can change very, very fast. And when the need comes, China will change overnight. It will shock you. And so I think that to look at China as a steady state economy, it's a very dangerous thing. It is totally, purely because of necessity that they have to do certain things. Let us not underestimate the intelligence of those guys. They're not stupid. And they know what they're doing. That doesn't mean that they won't get into trouble, but at least it is not just stupid. And when they realize that a certain turning point has arrived, they will change. And they would shock you. And by the way, I do not for a second think that the RMB is devaluating. It's some short-term cyclical necessity for them to just let it dip a little. It is totally unlike what Japan is doing, which is systemic. They want to make a big change. But you cannot accuse China. I don't think we can accuse China of letting the RMB drop right now. You can, of course, say that, hey, you guys really are bad in putting the $4 trillion RMB into the system in 2008, and that's really all the problem that we see today. That's true. But then if you turn the clock back, and at that time, they were the heroes. They were the first to react to the financial crisis. And so let me tell you finally, two more points. Why I think China, whereas for all those reasons you gave, Hamid, I think that for the next 3 years, as I said, 2-3 years, will be slower. But why do I think that in the longer run, say in the 3rd to the 10th year, it will grow back up? 3 reasons. Number one, the system is so irrational. There's so many nonsense in the system, irrational things in the system. Just correcting those things will bring in a lot of economic growth. Number two, the use of technology in the whole society is still very, very low, including many of the manufacturing and so forth. And the upgrading of that is going to also give a lot of productivity growth and hence economic development. And finally, urbanization is still ongoing, and I think that there will still be a driver. Then finally, to Dr. DePino's question, I think that China has no choice but to, because of the aging situation, that will have to go the way of Japan. In other words, they can no longer do what they have done, such as, cheap labor, manufacturing, export-led kind of economy. You will run out of people already, the laborers. And as a result, they have to change. And consumption-led economy, it's just a matter of time. It has a lot of issues that has to be resolved. But I think that that also presents a tremendous amount of opportunity. The gray hair, silver hair economies, China would just have to go the same way, although it would not be as fast as Japan, but I think that it will go in that direction. Rather, my worry is for India. Whereas they say that they have the demographic dividend ahead of them. I said, when you have 17, 18-year-old to 28-year-old who are out of a job, with all the testosterone that is going on, I said, wow, that is a dangerous thing. and with a democracy, they have a vote. And hence, what will happen is something that worries me. So the whole wide world is a pretty bad place. Not bad, but a pretty tough place. East Asia certainly included, South Asia certainly included. But I'm still worried first and foremost, the area that you two talk about, that is the Middle East. That before we blow ourselves up, I'm afraid that somebody is going to blow up the rest of the world from your part of the world.
Now, what do we do now? All right. The time has come for Ronnie's co-chair, Henrietta Fore, to come and lead the Innovation in Healthcare panel, but that was a pretty great tour, all three of you. Thank you very much, Ronnie, Mitch, and Hamid. Thank you.